The renewed phase of the Thailand-Cambodia border conflict did not erupt suddenly in 2008, but emerged from a long, deliberate attempt by Cambodia to rebuild national dignity after one of the 20th century's most devastating collapses, because following the Khmer Rouge genocide, decades of war, and international isolation, Cambodian leadership understood that survival alone was not enough and that the country needed symbols capable of reconnecting a traumatized population to a deeper historical identity. And in this context, Preah Vihear Temple was not merely an ancient ruin but a civilizational anchor, a visible reminder that Cambodia's story did not begin with mass graves or foreign intervention but with imperial achievement, spiritual authority, and architectural mastery, which is why the decision to pursue UNESCO World Heritage status in the early 2000s was framed domestically as cultural restoration and international reintegration rather than geopolitical provocation. Yet this initiative unfolded in a regional environment where historical grievances had never been processed or reconciled, particularly in Thailand, where the 1962 International Court of Justice ruling remained embedded in nationalist memory as a loss inflicted under colonial-era imbalance. And although decades had passed without open conflict, the emotional residue of that decision persisted in military institutions, conservative politics, and education systems, meaning that UNESCO's recognition of Preah Vihear under Cambodian ownership was interpreted not as neutral heritage protection but as final confirmation that Thailand had permanently lost something it believed was historically and culturally its own, an interpretation intensified by the physical reality that the temple remained far more accessible from the Thai side, reinforcing a sense of injustice rooted in lived geography rather than abstract law. This reaction coincided with a period of extreme political instability in Thailand, marked by mass protests, elite polarization, and repeated military interventions, creating fertile ground for nationalist symbols to be weaponized, as political factions accused rivals of surrendering sovereignty and betraying the nation, transforming Preah Vihear into a rallying point that fused historical grievance with contemporary power struggles and ensured that the dispute could no longer be contained within diplomatic channels. As nationalist rhetoric escalated, the dispute crossed a critical threshold from symbolic confrontation into physical militarization, because once political survival became tied to defending historical pride, restraint became politically dangerous, and both governments moved troops toward the border not simply for defense, but to demonstrate resolve to domestic audiences, turning the surrounding highlands and temple complexes into fortified zones where sacred stones were repurposed as cover, observation points, and strategic terrain, a transformation that revealed how quickly history can be converted into a weapon when identity and power converge. Between 2008 and 2011, a series of armed clashes unfolded that represented the most serious fighting between Thailand and Cambodia in modern times, involving artillery barrages, rocket fire, and sustained military engagements that killed soldiers on both sides and forced tens of thousands of civilians to flee their homes, often repeatedly. As ceasefires collapsed and tensions reignited, while villages near the border became ghost towns and families navigated landscapes contaminated by landmines left from earlier decades of conflict, compounding old trauma with new displacement. The damage inflicted on ancient structures during this period carried profound symbolic weight, because temples that had survived centuries of empire, neglect, and weather were now scarred by modern weapons, illustrating how contemporary nationalism can destroy what historical rivalry never did. And despite the presence of ASEAN as a regional framework designed to prevent such escalation, its mechanisms proved largely ineffective, constrained by principles of non-interference and the political cost of confronting member states driven by domestic nationalist pressure, exposing the limits of institutional diplomacy when conflict is fueled not by strategic calculation alone but by identity, memory, and emotional mobilization. For Western audiences, this phase of the conflict is especially instructive because it demonstrates that international law and cultural institutions, while essential, cannot operate in isolation from historical psychology, and that interventions intended to protect heritage or clarify sovereignty can instead accelerate confrontation when underlying narratives remain unresolved, as UNESCO's designation, though legally justified and culturally motivated, functioned as a catalyst that activated decades of suppressed resentment rather than a mechanism of reconciliation, pushing both states into positions where compromise was framed as weakness and escalation as patriotism. As clashes continued sporadically and diplomatic efforts faltered, the economic, human, and reputational costs mounted rapidly, threatening regional stability and undermining Southeast Asia's image as a zone of cooperation and growth, prompting renewed international attention and pressure, particularly as images of displaced civilians and damaged heritage sites circulated globally, contradicting narratives of peaceful integration. This environment eventually led Cambodia to return to the International Court of Justice, not to reopen the original ruling but to seek clarification on the areas surrounding the temple that had been left ambiguous in 1962. And in 2013 the court reaffirmed Cambodia's sovereignty over Preah Vihear and ordered the withdrawal of Thai forces from the contested zones, a decision that significantly reduced military tensions and restored a fragile calm along the border, yet once again resolved the conflict only at the legal level, leaving emotional grievances and competing historical narratives largely untouched. The aftermath of the 2013 ruling produced a peace defined less by reconciliation than by exhaustion, legal finality, and the recognition that continued escalation offered no strategic benefit, as diplomatic relations normalized, trade resumed, and tourists returned to sites once dominated by soldiers. Yet beneath this surface stability the deeper structures of the conflict remained intact, preserved within political discourse, nationalist education, and collective memory on both sides, meaning the dispute did not truly end but entered another suspended phase, vulnerable to revival whenever domestic instability or political competition demands a symbol capable of mobilizing identity and pride. The moral of this episode and of the conflict as a whole extends far beyond Southeast Asia, particularly for audiences in the UK, Canada, and Europe, because it reveals that peace achieved through courts, institutions, or fatigue is inherently fragile when it is not accompanied by honest engagement with the past, and that borders drawn through colonial logic, histories left unresolved, and identities exploited for short-term political survival do not fade with time but accumulate pressure across generations, turning cultural heritage into strategic terrain and memory into ammunition, reminding us that lasting stability is not built by winning legal arguments or silencing disputes, but by confronting uncomfortable histories openly and choosing shared humanity over inherited grievance, because when history is ignored it returns as violence, and when it is understood, it finally loses the power to divide.